Hello and welcome to the Kevin, the Great Witness, the New Adventure Series is. And here we are with Dean Kevin, and I'm Dean Bell, and Kevin will be sharing his experiences, his real side experiences with us, and we'll be commenting and asking questions. So welcome again, Kevin, and I look forward to hearing what you have today.
This real side experience would seem to be a rescue of a kind, so I will dub it a rescue on the real side. What seemed to be the situation was that a large number of individuals, the exact quantity indeterminable, were being held, contained, and locked into a state of being or existence from which, without assistance, there would be no chance of escape. We might say this about the human race in general, or indeed innumerable species where this situation would apply, where beings are locked into control systems. We can't really say, through no fault of their own, as everything is based on agreement, and if we are in a controlled, experiential situation, then we have agreed to the particulars of the causes that have effected this to be so, although agreement that has been trawled through deceptive marketing ploy tactics that on the surface would appease the one-dimensional senses, but the intent and purpose of which are anything but beneficial, and the evidence is plain to see, as the effects overall are made manifest in everyday experience. And overall, the real purpose for every individual in creation is to learn to stand real with the ears in recognition of it, even though the vast majority are struggling to determine this, because without the references available, decisions, focus and attention are rather limited to that which is provided, that everyone is indoctrinated by, through the social programming systems in place. So yes, we might say there is little or no chance of escape from such a creational restricting predicament, absent of assistance of the real guides and Dwayne, who has made this true reality known through the references he has created, recognized, and provided. So, as I was saying, in this real side experience, a rescue was in effect, to extricate those from a contained predicament and situation that, as is the case with everything in creation, must be based on agreement somewhere, consciously or more likely subconsciously, that allowed this to be so. Those that were contained seemed to consist of children, the number of which, as I alluded to, was large, but certainly not the entirety of the children that make up the human race at this time, more like a select group that had been somehow removed, displaced, and relocated in a kind of obscure pocket dimension or alternative realm or place in creation. For these children, and they seemed to be humans as far as I could determine, they seemed somewhat oblivious to the situation they found themselves in, as though somehow bewitched, or in a trance, as though to them everything was as it should be. It was as though the dark forces, or elements of them, had sequestered this large body of human children, and secured them in this curious alternative dimension or place, for whatever reasons they had for doing so, and by such a means that the children seemed unaware that this had occurred, almost as though inserted in a kind of illusion that would seem normal on the surface. I had the impression that these children were very promising in regards to having potential to waking up this lifetime around and beginning their own processes of becoming more aware, or perhaps continuing from where they may have left off in previous lifetimes. As such, and with every individual who becomes more aware, this poses as a threat to the dark forces, who are terrified of individuals becoming more aware that they then are beyond the control of the dark forces, and indeed for every individual becoming aware, so agreement is retracted, agreement that holds up the control systems in all its creational forms. And so, as the dark forces determined this particular group of children to be such individuals who would be deciding to become more aware, they rather intervened, taking advantage of agreements that allowed them to execute a kidnapping, a relocation, and a containing of these children in this curious pseudo-dimension, and inserting them in a kind of illusory smoke screen that had the children oblivious of what had befallen them, an illusory smoke screen on top of the surface, one-dimensional, dark force created illusion already in effect and agreed to, so almost a case of being inside a created illusion contained within one that already is in agreed to effect. This decided action by the dark forces had the overall desired effect, in that the vast majority of these children, even though promising candidates for being given the opportunity by the guides as they were, based on their readiness for it, were now unreachable, locked into an agreed-to bubble of illusory creational containment that disallowed any influx of assistance from the guides. There was no means of penetration, unless some agreement could be ventured that allowed life to shine through a crack. However, despite these measures, there were a group of children within the larger group who, although trapped as all the children were, had extended agreement to receive assistance, had on some level of themselves intuitive or real awareness, realized their situation, realized they could not extricate themselves from it alone, and had made a cry for help, as it were, and based on their sincerity of their position as being those ready to begin their awareness processes, the real guides had answered the call. The guides had, it seemed, assigned this rescue task to me and another individual, a man who I could not identify, and we had agreed to undertake this assignment. Interestingly, the total number of children that requested assistance and extraction were 11, and the idea of the real side experience seemed to present as though I were the father of 6 of these children, and the other man was the father of 5. But it seemed more that we were simply assigned the extraction and then the protection of these valuable children, valuable and precious in that they were those about to begin their awareness process, and at such a vulnerable stage of it, as was the case here, where through lack of awareness they were very much able to be kidnapped and contained, and so it was imperative to afford them every protection that was possible with the agreement parameters the children decided upon and allowed. So I was rather assigned 6 children and the other man 5, and perhaps maybe there was even past lifetime affiliation elements coming into play. Perhaps the children we each were to protect we had known in previous lifetime positions in whatever roles we played out, so a familiarity would perhaps make for a more likely agreement for protection to those the children had known from a creational perspective. After all, those on very similar stages of their process through creation are bound to align through lifetimes. As the effect similarities in the decisions, choices, and life positions would naturally translate as shared experiences, as the particulars come into a conjunction and alignment, as cause to effects converge. Although we were both assigned this task, the other man took a degree of encouraging, as though a little reluctant to participate, but it seemed this was his part to play, as though without him the 5 children he was assigned to rescue could not be extracted, and going alone would have me only able to assist then the 6 that I was to be assisting. He would agree eventually, and the rescue was afoot. The idea was that I would go in, get the children's attention, extract them, and he would provide the means of escape. He had a very large car that would accommodate the 11 children, like a getaway driver, although he would not be entering the dimension where the children were, by virtue of his agreement and role he would be playing, this still facilitated the ability to rescue the 5 children then assigned to his care. The scene would switch, and I seemed to be in a large theatre, rows of seats that ascended upward, and the steps either side of the theatre, and seats that did likewise. I would scale the steps, and at a certain point the real awareness knew when to stop and turn to the left, facing the seats that were there, and then to walk forwards, which should have had me crashing into the seats, but instead it was as though I went through an invisible door or portal to the place where the children were contained. So it was a kind of surface illusion, and a point in which that allowed access to where the children were, but only for those who knew the exact means of access, those who had created it, the dark forces, or those who could see it through a real awareness that can see all of the ideas that make up creation. The scene switched, and here I was, in this pocket-dimensional containment area, that who knew how it would have looked or seemed to the children it contained, as whatever agreements held them here and had allowed their capture, so agreements would also create whatever visual illusion encapsulated them in this place. To my view, it was as though the children were being militarized, regimented, conditioned, routined, as they all were marching up and down in columns, like you see with military displays provided for the generals and politicians, although no other people or controllers did I see at this moment. The children would continue this regimented action, as though in a trance, and as I said, the majority of which were so locked in, so agreeable, despite them being overall ready for their awareness recognition, that they could not see me. They couldn't see beyond the reality that had encapsulated them here. Perhaps we could say then the majority were not quite ready then, but there or thereabouts, and it required that extra push, that extra drive, intent and spark of determination to break out and get through this predicament. The 11 children who would fit then this category would recognize me, would see me through the illusions the others could not, and the moment they did, in came the controllers, as they too realized the situation and the attempted rescue. But there seemed no need to engage the dark forces, as I seemed to retain effectively a real awareness standing that was beyond their ability to impact. I was in a reality that had no agreements that they could take advantage of and feature in the effects that such agreements provide, whereas were I to stand in my personal self more so, with all the ideas that make up its construction, I stand in a reality then where the dark forces can take advantage of ideas of the personal self I am now agreeing with as I stand in it, and can feature in the effect experiences and execute their various decided attacks, and so forth. And so the dark forces are presented as though they were attacking me, but I just walked past them, as though the attacks on me were in their own minds, and maybe from their perspective they were attacking successfully the created idea that was my personal self. But my real awareness was aside from whatever they were seeing from their limited personal self-view, and the 11 children accompanied me, and we simply departed. Had I chosen to attack the dark forces, then I would have been standing in the creational reality of the personal self. You can't engage with a creational idea and feature in the experience effect of it unless you also operate in a creation that you take on such effects. And so the scene faded, but we had to depart by an alternative means, as the individual, the other man, who was to be the getaway driver, had transitioned seemingly, had passed on, and wasn't in a position to complete his part, which really meant he had decided not to. But his agreement to that point at least had allowed the rescue of the 5 he was to be assigned. The scene switched, and there was a kind of a brief interlude between the scene just experienced and what would transpire next with the rescued children. For I found myself in a dazzling, overwhelmingly white place, amidst a number of people. All here seemed to be aware individuals, and my impression were many of which were the real guides. I seemed to have in my hand a kind of staff or other, and now it was as though I was being presented with another, almost an upgraded version. I would place my current staff aside, and one individual that I impressioned as a real guide would present me with a new staff of gold, and also a kind of glowing crystal globe that attached to the top. The globe contained something, but I'm uncertain as to what it was. The scene seemed to be representing then, overall, a kind of token or gesture, an acknowledgement of my services in supporting of the true reality, and my completion of this rescue mission that had liberated these 11 children, who were considered very precious by the real guides. The scene switched again, and the setting seemed to be another sort of dimensional place or realm within creation, almost like a safe house or safe area, and one afforded by the real guides. For the 11 rescued children were here, in what looked like a sort of quaint Victorian street setting, although generally safe. For whatever reason, the dark forces seemed to know of this location and could access it. perhaps agreements still retained through the children to these dark force characters would mean that the dark forces could access this place and attempt to steal back the children. After all, these children were new to their process of awareness, so naturally all manner of agreements were available that the dark forces could take advantage of. But this place was still considered the safest place for the children to be, as though they needed a kind of temporary refuge. And interestingly, the window of dark force attack opportunity was only open for one night. After that, it was as though the children would be safe from being returned to the dark forces containment dimensional place, as though that was the time needed for the children to sever agreement that would allow for such. Featuring here also was the wife or partner of the other man who had been part of the rescue assignment but who had transitioned, and she was distraught at his passing, emotionally attached to him as she was. It seemed, in fact, she and this man had both been assigned and were to be responsible for the group of the 5 children, that somehow her own previous agreements had helped facilitate the capturing of those particular 5, through whatever ways all the various agreements intertwined, meshed, and made that so. For she was stationed here in this place, and was prepared to make a stand against the inevitable dark force attack, as though she had been unconscious to her agreements that had played a part in the children's capture, but now she had the opportunity to assist, and had willingly accepted, stepped up, having realizing her poor prior decisions. She had awareness to a degree, but her emotional attachments with the man who was her partner were an indication that, like us all, she was very new at this. For she would be seemingly hungry, and the idea was that she hadn't eaten prior to this night stand, and that to have eaten would have been preferable, as though she had been rather starved of awareness through her self-limiting choices and agreements, and an awareness she was more so now through her intent to be so and step up, but an awareness she could have done with being more so than she was, that would have allowed her to be more effective had she not chosen and decided poorly as she had. Interestingly, she seemed to be in the form of a white horse, rather like a unicorn. I was here also, and as this was very much a creationally based situation, a dark force bid to reclaim the children, I was operating within this idea also, interjecting myself into what would be the effects, and making my stand with them. The children also would be defending themselves, and it seemed it was imperative to prevent the dark force invaders from entering certain buildings here, as though to do so would allow them to reclaim the children. 2 buildings were the targets, and the group of 5 children would be defending one, and the group of 6 the other. It was as though the buildings they defended represented an overall created consciousness, personal self-construction of agreements held by each group of children, that if breached, if entered, represented agreement to allow their recapture. For the agreements would be retained, seemingly, for this one night duration, until they perhaps could be released, as though this were the required time for the tapline release. So for the dark forces to have access to personal self representing houses where the agreements lay, represented the dark forces successfully securing agreement to be able to take advantage of these agreements to recapture the children. It was then all depending on the children as to if they retained the agreement to allow capture, if the dark forces entered these buildings, or if they decided to go about the process of releasing the tapline agreements, that would take this night to do so, and thus defend these personal self-representing buildings successfully. Also, the group of 5 children were in the form of antlered stags, and the other group in another form that I was unable to recall on waking, and so we made our stand and prepared to last through the night. But as is very clear here, it was all based on agreement, and we could only assist the children according to the parameters of their agreements. And really, when it came down to it, as is the case with everyone, the children were the deciders, and nothing can impose on their experience without agreements that allow the imposition.
Yeah, I jotted some notes down here. Practically, yeah, impossible to escape this matrix, this creation without knowing that you're, first of all, in it, that you're in creation and you need to escape. Most people are so fine with being here that they don't even want to leave or escape. So that's the first part. These kids seem to want to, knew they were imprisoned or captured, so you help them the first experience. But most people in the public don't even admit that or know it or recognize it. So that's the first thing. And then he said, yeah, they need to assist him to the parameters to their agreement. If they don't agree to wanting to leave or to recognize more, they won't. The real guides provide possibilities, so they're just providing possibilities here. There still needs to be agreement and decision to see more. And then the fun thing here, you had the was the golden staff, something they gave you or something? Yeah. We also, back in Huntington Beach, we had Claudia saw this. Claudia was one of our seers. She had a experience where we were at a big table, huge table. Some of us were doing this. I think Kelsey and Henry and Dwayne and the real guides provided this table setting. It was like a party of gratitude, like it was a gratitude for what we were doing, and they were providing each of us with our special, what we liked. For me, it was like this little chocolate mint that I used to like to eat. So they gave me that, and each person got what they especially were, like to, their little favorite treat, just as a thank you. So we get these once in a while, we get these confirmations that of gratitude that, what we're doing is appreciated, and that's neat to hear what you got there. And you are doing a lot, so you're much appreciated. We have a guest here, and she wanted to be a seer, so Dwayne was talking to her just now about, well, just sing the NUUU, see what the guides show you, and if you're really interested, you'll be letting go of some of these old ideas you have and attachments and tap lines, like these ideas about spirits helping you and being a channeler and all this stuff. First of all, you're not going to go that far without letting go of some things here, because we're working inside and outside creation, you could say, both. But really, to be a good seer, you need to know, or you need to see, beyond creation, that there's possibility beyond seeing what is in creation. So he was just talking to her about that. And we get a lot of people like that are interested, but once they find out that it's nothing that they can relate to, a lot of them don't pursue it. So we'll see how far this young lady goes. So
this real side experience would begin in the recreated house of my deceased grandparents. Generally, houses on the real side representing the personal self of the individual, as the house they dwell in on the physical is recreated, but with the additional size and capacity required for all the parts of the self that the individual is unconscious of. So, if we find ourselves in the houses of others on the real side, we are either invited or have imposed on their personal self-experience in some way. When it comes to the real awareness, being to being isness reality, however, we can't ever really say we are invited or can impose on another's experience, as from that view we all would be this isness awareness, and there can't be any notion of separation there that requires then invitation. In this real side experience, despite it being the recreated house of my deceased grandparents, this was not their personal selves that I was engaging with, for in fact their house has been recreated, yes, but reconstructed by the real guides, and rather it is used as a kind of meeting place with them on the occasion that I do. I always had the notion that the reason for this was that anything that occurs on the personal side of the real side that doesn't require real awareness recognition to decipher is accessible to any individual, ill or well-intended. Sometimes the real guides present what they do in a way that requires the exercising of our real awareness recognitional muscles. The recognition we need to perceive the ears through the real awareness is that which they are stretching through the real side experiences, as it is the same recognition that is needed to determine the real side isness impressions they infuse our experiences with. The recognition of the experiences beyond the literal visuals that the personal self can perceive, or maybe experiences in their entirety, will require recognition if they consist just of impressions. Recognitional exercises aside, this same methodology can be used to conceal certain information from the personal self. The real awareness might be able to read what is conveyed, but the personal self can't. If something is being made available for a personal self to understand, the personal selves of any individual can potentially access it too on the real side, with the dark forces being a personal self literally immersed. They then will lack the awareness to decipher information that is presented through these impressions that require real awareness standing and recognition through it to decipher. But if we then do the recognitional work, if we determine the impressions and pass them on to the personal self, then the dark forces or whoever can still then access the deciphered information that enters then the personal self arena. So again, this is why sometimes the real awareness keeps certain details and information from its personal self, that the information remains in the reality of what is real, and only those with this recognitional real awareness prowess can access it, and it won't be used for controlling purposes, as would be the dark forces' motivation. And so, if we have personal self experiences that are very upfront, very apparent, that require no recognition, and if the dialogue is conveyed verbally also, with no impressions to translate, then what the personal self learns, the dark forces can access. But sometimes, perhaps, guides like to drop information directly to the personal self, that nothing is lost in translation. And so they have created, by my estimation, what would seem to anyone on the real side to be another one of these personal self recreated houses, and would just pass on by if they had no business there. Almost like a disguise then, a secret safe house, made to look like my deceased grandmother's house, that when these very open personal self experience meetings and dialogues take place on the real side, they do so in the confines of what looks to be just another one of these personal self-houses, and no one comes eavesdropping in on the conversation. But then recently, the dark forces have cottoned onto this recreated house meeting place, and constructed their own faked version to trick me, garner agreement, and tapline me. But generally, I see through the deception of not only their version of the house, but the dark force characters also, who try to replicate the real guides that I have occasional meetings with in the genuine version of the house. As such, I hadn't had genuine meetings in this house for a time, until this real side experience several months ago. I, Real Awareness, read the house as being the real guide constructed one, and indeed, my deceased grandfather was present, the form commonly adopted by a real guide on the real side in my various experiences. I have the impression the guide that adopts this form is REBISAR, as I find him a rather no-nonsense, all-business individual. And again, over time, you develop an internal catalogue of signature impressions that you recognize individuals through, despite the outward forms they adopt. And real guides have a sense about them that can't be replicated, an intensity of real purpose-isness. And so, this guide in this real side experience was genuine also, and the house was full of other individuals, all of the awareness becoming inclination and real intent orientated. It rather fell on me to keep order, as it were, as it was like being in a room full of unruly, squabbling children. There were little disputes, arguments, etc., that I had to help resolve. The real guide, in my grandfather's form, would just sit and wait patiently until all settled down, and only then would he raise himself to his feet, and we all gathered in one area of the house. What happened then was by his hand, and he seemed to facilitate access to another dimension or place. I'm uncertain where it was precisely, but was in creation, as I had the impression I was rather given the responsibility of all these individuals, as though they were just beginning on their decided process of awareness, and as such, it's unlikely their recognition would extend beyond creation. A curious circular pattern formed on the floor, one consisting of a series of geometrical shapes made of glowing light. As I watched, each individual here in turn would step into the center of this pattern, and when positioned correctly, would connect with the dimension or place this pattern linked with. This occurrence was familiar to me. I knew I had experienced this before, and in this lifetime also, and indeed it fell upon me to make a few minute adjustments to the pattern to ensure it was aligned. I would move my hands across the pattern and make the required alterations instinctively, or real awareness knowing as to how this was done. My personal self confused as to what my real awareness was doing, but rather went along with it, as though this was expected of me, that I had done this before, and now was given the opportunity to assist the guide, for I knew that even though, from the group and my perspective, the individual whose turn it was standing in the centre of a glowing pattern on the floor, from their view they were standing in this other place or dimension that this geometrical form was now connected with, and dialoguing with a being that resided there. This was evidently a beneficial situation for the individuals here, orchestrated and overseen by the real guide, and my opportunity to participate in the assisting of others on their process also, which I always find quite the honour and privilege. What greater thing can there be than to help others with a process that will save them from creation? It was complete. Each individual had in turn engaged with the being that resided on the other end of where this pattern of lights connected them to, and now I was invited to have my turn, and I would step into the central part of the geometrical design. I found myself instantly in another place, the house where I was now gone. It was a kind of dark setting. The ground was of stone, and indeed I seemed to be standing in what looked like a sort of ancient stone monument, though open to the skies, like a kind of Stonehenge. Plinths of stone surrounding this central area, with many individuals standing between the spaces. My impressions were that they all had great awareness. Some were undoubtedly the real guides. As I said, I had the sense of having done this before, recollection of the geometrical design that was used, and now in this place. I had full recall of coming here constantly when I was a child, but had since forgotten. Sometimes we have had experiences that the personal self will only be shown at a time when the individual has decided to become more aware, or is at a certain stage of that process, and what may be a new experience for us can be one we actually had long ago. But then in reality there is no time, so really it's just what we happen to view at any given moment, and then the personal self decides a kind of a linear sequence of events for itself. Sometimes we have real side experiences that seem to be awareness bolstering, guide provided when we are children, before we are indoctrinated and locked into the literalized personal self. Beyond the ability of life and the guides to get through to us, as we encase ourselves in our illusionary, limited bubbles of conviction. And also, if the guides see that we are getting ready for our awareness process, preparation for it will be taking place with the real awareness over many lifetimes of the personal self, even as the personal self is locked into itself and is unaware of this. And so it's to be expected that before indoctrination each lifetime around, the child will have the kind of real side experiences that reflect this decision to become more aware, a decision the real awareness has made, but the personal self may as yet not realize or understand. This was probably the case with myself this lifetime around, as I have been reintroduced to many real side experiences I had as a child that I had forgotten until I revisited them, or was shown them again by the real guides in more recent times. For as I said, I was frequently once visiting this place through that geometrical pattern, and it was here that I would speak always with the being that resided here. And here it was again. It had a curious body type, hard to describe, almost slug-like, a little like Jabba the Hutt from Star Wars, though always exuding a positive, cheerful attitude. I can't remember what we once spoke about. For all the times I once came here as a child, only that it was a constant, real side experience, and this slug being was very wise and seemed to know everything. My impression now, as I was reacquainted with him, was that this being had a mighty awareness, not far from that of a real guide by my estimation. So evidently the real guides had been facilitating my journey to this place when I was a child, for the advice, preparation, and counsel this being could provide, in addition to their own, that would assist and prepare me for what was to come later this lifetime. And here this being was delighted to meet me again, and would bestow upon me insights and wisdoms that only a highly aware being could divulge. The experience ended here, and perhaps I may have further meetings with this being, and other new friends may have experiences with him also, because it does seem that this individual is working with the guides to provide an overall real education on the real side, and assist everyone with becoming more aware, and that he seems to be stationed in some dimension or realm that only the real guides know of and can access.
And I've heard, when I first heard that, I say, oh yeah, this makes sense about dreams being, or real side experiences being disguised, so the bad guys don't see it. You know, the real guides disguise certain things in symbolism or different ways of demonstrating things, so they can't pick it up, but it's on us to pick it up through our references. But it's like being a spy, you know, doing different codes and everything. It's like some of these experiences are like codes we have to figure out. But, and then there's the people disguising themselves as, you know, somebody we may know, that, like Dwayne says, all deception shows up. So eventually, either through time lapse or something, through just waiting, you know, or to seeing what happens through experiences, you'll see deception will show up, or these people will show their real face. It's interesting the way it works, you know. I mean, if you're sincere and if you have the intent, things will show up, you know, and you'll get through the so-called evil or so-called dark forces. You don't have to have any kind of belief or anything, or a doctrine to follow or spiritual path. You can just be sincere and you get through things. You'll just cut right through things that you might not otherwise do with the belief system that will actually burden you and tap line you to certain areas. And your adventures are so cool. It's so cool to hear what you're doing and how there's so many possibilities. For some, it's like boring, you know, like what's out there, you know, I mean, creation is the thrill here. So what's there, but you make it so it is kind of, there's so many, this being you talked about, this guy, you know, that working with the real guides. I mean, meeting individuals like that on the real side, I mean, that's cool. I mean, that's so cool. You know, it's a grand adventure. And there's so many of these experiences we can have out there in creation, and then as well as, of course, the recognition of the isness that just is. So, thank you, Kevin. Jeremy, do you have anything or an experience you'd like to share?
No experience I would like to share. I thought it was interesting though about the geometric shapes. When it comes to portals and moving around places, of course, it's just reference, not necessarily the reality of it, but in a creational sense, that I do see a lot of that. Like when I construct portals on the real side, it's either like almost like alchemy, like where it's just like symbols and things like that, or you'd make things with your hands and then it appears. So it's a type like that being utilized in creation to kind of here and there.
I remember this Netflix series. I think it was about magicians. They would do all kinds of hand, you know, to get to the portal or to get through their whatever they're doing, conjuring up. But they would do all kinds of hand motions. Yeah. Figures, you know, that wouldn't make sense, but they didn't. Well, I mean, they did to them, yeah, but like Dwayne says, math is everything. So figures, shapes, math, numbers, these are all correspond or references to portals or just experiences we could have, which we don't here, which is so literal. It's so literal here that people are so dumbed down, they don't see so much, you know. They're just stuck. And that's why we're here on Stick'em. Okay, well, thanks again, Kevin, for doing this. It's great. Thanks for keeping it up. I know it takes a lot of stamina and endurance, so thank you very much for being here. And thank you, Jeremy, for your support. NUUU. Jeremy? Kevin?